Hello everyone and welcome to Capital A. For our second episode, I want to talk a little bit about the effect that concentrations of capital have on life as a working artist. And I think as working artists, many of us have this experience that, all of our hard work kind of turns into sending stuff into the void. It's not just that nowadays it often seems like you spend more time hustling than actually producing your work. It's also that hustle seems to bring back less and less of a return. It's like you try and you work and you work on your craft, and each time you go through that emotional labor of just forcing yourself to keep going. And it's not that people don't notice. Maybe they even acknowledge what you're trying to do. It's just that it never seems to translate into anything more than like a pat on the back. Good job. It's like the world has run out of shits to give or breaks to be caught. And this, I think, is an effect of the concentration of capital.
The top 0.1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%.
We've all heard Bernie say this hundreds of times at this point, and it isn't a new idea. Back in the 1850s, Karl Marx himself identified a certain internal tendency for capital to accumulate at the top. He defines this in the first volume of Capital as concentration of capitals already formed, destruction of their individual independence, expropriation of capitalist by capitalist, transformation of many small into few large capitals. Capital grows in one place to a huge mass in a single hand because it has been lost in another place by many. It always ends in the ruin of many small capitalists, whose capitals partly pass into the hand of their conquerors, partly vanish. The internal tendency of capital, when left to its own devices, is not to circulate, but to stultify and to accumulate at the very top and just sit there. If there is a thing that capital can be said to want, that thing might be a world where one person owns everything and everyone else owns nothing. Of course, there are other dynamics that oppose this tendency. For instance, just after World War II, the GI Bill was a huge factor in redistributing wealth from the top to the many, right? But if left to its own devices, so to speak, this is what capitalism tends to do. So how does this tendency for capital to accumulate at the very top, which we have seen transform the entire world over the last 40 or 50 years, affect life for working artists? I'm going to try to tackle this question in a 3-part episode. Part 1, today's video, is going to be about how concentrations of capital at the top of the market affect artists' lives on a sort of more systemic, macro-dynamic level. Part 2, the episode next time, is going to be about how these concentrations of capital and this system of competition between artists sours the microdynamics of relationships between artists or between artists and patrons or artists and, whoever else they have in their constellation of relations. And then part 3 is going to be a few things that we as kind of everyday ordinary people or lovers of art or, people who are not millionaires can do to make life a little bit easier on working artists. So to start with the macro level, what I've done is I've asked a few of my friends working in different kind of subfields of creative labor to describe for me what they think the tendency has been, economically speaking, in their field over the last 40 or 50 years. And in each of these subfields, you're going to see the same structure repeat itself, where instead of a nice, even bell curve distribution, where there's a lot of people in the middle, a few at the top, and a few at the bottom, you're going to see a few people with all the resources at the top and a whole bunch of people at the very bottom with practically nothing. We're going to start with violist Georgina Rossi and her thoughts on orchestras. So if you go back about 50 years, you'll see that the number of small towns and medium-sized cities in this country with their own regional orchestras was much higher than it is today. This is particularly strange given that the population of the Earth in 1970 was half of what it is right now. So what that means is that over the last 50 years, you've seen this kind of counterintuitive tendency where the population has doubled, but the number of orchestras serving that population has decreased significantly. Many have lost their funding and have had to cut their musicians' salaries by basically to unsustainable levels, and many others have just closed altogether. Until nowadays, what you have is a few big-name orchestras like the New York Phil, which are able to pay their musicians quite a bit for their work, and many more, although still not as many as there used to be, smaller orchestras where musicians are basically just scraping to get by and fighting to make ends meet. How is it possible? How do we understand that the potential market for listeners of orchestral music has doubled, whereas the number of orchestras keeps decreasing and decreasing and decreasing? Well, there are a number of factors at work here. I would imagine that government funding plays a large part in this dynamic. As we all know, government funding for the arts has practically vanished over the last 50 years. But I think you can't understand this dynamic without taking into account vectors of distribution. If you go back like 50 or 60 years, say you're living in a small town in upstate New York and you want to listen to orchestral music. You have a few options only, right? You can try to catch an orchestral concert on the radio. You can buy a record player and purchase records. Or you can physically travel to an orchestra, a town with an orchestra, and attend a concert. Compare that to nowadays when, with YouTube, iTunes, and the internet, anyone sitting anywhere in the world can tune into a concert by the New York Phil anytime they want to. What this means is that because the vectors of distribution are much more plentiful and much cheaper than they used to be, it's possible for one orchestra, the New York Phil, for example, to serve many, 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 many times more people than it used to be able to. At the same time, people aren't using those vectors to tune into their local orchestra, but more often than not, to some one or two or three of the biggest names out there. The New York Phil, the Berlin Philharmoniker, etc. Whether this is because they're just afraid that they don't know enough about music to be able to distinguish bad playing from good playing, or because they're starfuckers who want to tell all their friends that they listen to that symphony played by the New York Phil. Given the opportunity, many people prefer big brand names to their own regional orchestras. You can think of the resulting structure as, in some ways, the opposite of George Orwell's Big Brother or Foucault's Panopticon. Instead of one point at the center that looks out at all the points at the periphery, what you have are many peripheral points that all look in towards one or just a few points at the center. This is a structure that was perhaps best described by the French philosopher Guy Debord in his book, The Society of the Spectacle. Nowadays, we tend to remember Guy Debord as that guy that talked about media spectacle and all that stuff, but in his own words, quote, "The spectacle is not a collection of images. Rather, it is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images." And maybe if I were writing this book, I would have said, it is the lack of a social relationship between people that is mediated by images. A little later, Debord goes on to say, "Spectators are linked only by a one-way relationship to the very center that maintains their isolation from one another. The spectacle thus unites what is separate, but it unites it only in its separateness." So in the world of classical music, what this means is that instead of a whole bunch of people patronizing their small local orchestras, everyone, as the population of the earth keeps growing, tunes into just a few big-name orchestras at the very center of the industry. The result is that those few orchestras are able to compensate their musicians extremely well, while all the rest of the orchestras out there that are starving for funds and attention are barely able to scrape by at all. This is especially unfortunate given that there is no necessary relationship between how famous something is and how good it is, right? In my personal opinion, the New York Phil, for example, hasn't been at the top of its game in decades, while the most interesting work happening in classical music nowadays tends to be, made by the unknown musicians at the outskirts who are extremely overqualified, extremely skilled, and extremely undercompensated. Needless to say, the competition for these orchestra positions is absolutely fierce. We're talking hundreds of hyper-qualified applicants for one position. This increased competition means that oftentimes dozens of the people getting turned away from each position are better qualified, better trained, and more skilled than half the people in the section who applied for the position and got tenure 20 or 30 years ago when the competition was less fierce. This accounts for the decreased quality in some of our big-name orchestras, even as thousands of hyper-qualified musicians go without work. In the classical music world, as in practically every other field of creative labor, what you are seeing is that more and more people are getting their cultural fix from fewer and fewer sources. This is a dynamic we also see in the subfield of fine art print shops. This next analysis comes to you courtesy of master printmaker Lane Sell of Shoestring Press in Brooklyn, who says that just as with orchestras, what you're seeing nowadays is that maybe half a dozen or so big names like Pace or Gemini are able to command extraordinary fees for working with artists, while all the rest of the independent print shops in the country are basically competing amongst themselves for peanuts. Now, if you don't know what it is exactly that a fine art print shop does, printmaking processes like lithography, etching, or even silkscreen are often extremely technically involved and require lots of very expensive equipment, things that would render them essentially out of reach for most artists if they didn't have a master printmaker like my friend Lane to help them with their experience and with their equipment to produce the kinds of work that they want to be able to produce in these media. Fine art print shops play an invaluable role in the art market where they work with gallerists and artists to produce much of the work being shown and sold at every price point. However, very few of them are able to request the kind of compensation that makes their work ultimately sustainable. The print shops that work with the biggest names in the field are able to command exorbitant prices for their services. And those price points allow them to throw what is essentially an infinite amount of resources at any given project. Because printmaking is such a technical field, it doesn't just rest, or the final product doesn't just rest on the skill of the printmaker, it also rests on the resources that you're able to throw at a problem, which is to say the amount of pulls you're able to make, the amount of assistants you're able to hire, the amount of days you're able to rent out the print shop for. If you make, 500 prints for an edition that is ultimately going to get whittled down to 25, you're able to make 25 prints that come out looking absolutely flawless. This is not the kind of resource pool that smaller print shops are able to command when they fulfill an order. To be clear here, we're not talking about a standard which is very good and which other craftsmen are too lazy to reach. We're talking about a level of machine-like consistency and intricacy which only money can buy, and which erases all traces of the processes, the labor, and the capital which went into its creation. To quote Lane, "The inhuman work erases the value of the craft of printmaking precisely because it uses money to erase all marks of craft." As a result, people that see it, that are not printmakers, simply have no idea what went into it, and cannot, for the life of them, fathom why you would need X amount of dollars to reproduce it. Because printmaking is such a technically complex and little understood field, and because printmakers themselves have traditionally tried to disappear into the work of the artist that has hired them to help them with an edition, very few people have an understanding of the resources that it takes to produce a perfect print. As a result, what often happens is that clients will play independent print shops off of each other in a race to the bottom to produce perfect prints for peanuts. What you have are gallerists and artists coming in who are demanding top-of-the-line work, the kind that they saw coming out of Pace, but are only able to pay a micro fraction of what it costs to produce that work. And if you, as a small independent print shop, are not able to produce work at that same inhuman standard set by Pace, or if you have the temerity to actually ask for the fee that it would take you to produce that work, the client will simply go to someone else and ask for the same thing, inhuman standard at subhuman pay. And the danger is your competitor might just take that job at a huge loss to themselves for the sake of the exposure that it supposedly will bring. Now you might wonder why it seems that there is no middle ground here. Why you are either one of the half a dozen or so print shops at the top of the market that is able to command exorbitant fees and infinite resources in preparing an edition, or you are one of the sea of small independent print shops that is fighting amongst itself constantly in a race to the bottom for the peanuts. And this, I think, is an effect of more global market trends. To wit, there are simply no middle-class artists that are capable of sustaining a population of middle price point print shops. You are either a superstar like Jeff Koons, who gets paid millions for each piece, or you are trying to sustain your art career by working some other job in some other field. The middle ground here is vanishing very quickly, as it is in the middle class in general. To move along to our next subfield, I want to read to you the thoughts of novelist and journalist Sam Ashworth, who has the following to say about institutions in the field of writing. Sam says, "We shouldn't forget that as artists, we deeply covet the stamp of approval, the imprimatur that these publications bring. I love writing for the Washington Post because even though it constrains the hell out of my writing, I know that what I write will get read. You say, art needs to thrive between the institutions." That's in reference to my previous episode. "The thing is, my art," that is writing, "is 100% dependent on institutions. Agencies, editors, magazines, and journals. But if you're on the outside of those institutions, as almost everyone is at the beginning, it can be unbelievably hard to master the shibboleths and secret handshakes that mark one as the real deal. The simpler way to put this is, it is very hard to know how to present oneself as a professional artist such that other artists will buy it. Because, of course, everyone is making it up as they go along. The trouble is getting in stride with the others as they go. It feels like there's no room for anarchy, at least not any that pays the bills. There will be room for anarchy, we think, once we have made it. And you know what? I think there will be." Now, Sam does not explicitly say this, but I would add, and maybe he can correct me if I'm wrong, that because writing is inherently so dependent on its institutions, which are simultaneously its vectors of distribution, which is to say, publishing houses and publications, writing as a field is perhaps even more vulnerable to concentrations of capital that happen elsewhere in the market. So, for example, as Amazon pulls the rug out from under the publishing houses, and as Facebook has decimated the market for local news media outlets, these tendencies for a few big giant firms to concentrate all the capital in themselves perhaps affect writers even more than artists working in other fields of creative production. For a perspective on the theater, I want to read to you the thoughts of an assistant director on Broadway who would prefer to remain anonymous. According to our informant, one of the first things to understand about life in the American theater is that if you're a director or an assistant director or a stage manager or a stage designer, set designer, you are de facto independent, a freelancer who roves from production to production trying to make a living. While in Europe they may have such things as state-funded theaters with salaried positions for theater directors or stage managers or whatever, in the United States that's simply not the case. At every level, from the most successful to the most obscure, you are essentially a freelancer, with all the attendant lack of job security and all the instability that comes with it. If, as a theater director, you are looking for something with a little bit more security, you have the option, assuming you can get the work, of becoming a resident director at a long-running Broadway play. This is generally considered a very good gig because it pays something and there's a level of stability, but it does tend to lead to career stagnation because you're on that thing for a year, 2 years, many years, and essentially you have to turn down other, perhaps more creative projects in order to hold on to that position. Another option, if you can make it that far, is to become the creative director of an established theater company. And a creative director is also a salaried position potentially, but it's less of a creative position, more of a fundraising, networking, PR type position, which you might not be interested in if what drew you to the theater in the first place was the craft. Again, this requires an entire lifetime of successfully hustling at the bare subsistence level of a self-employed theater director before you are, prestigious enough or you have a big enough name that someone will hire you to be the creative director of a theater company. Another important thing to understand about life as a theater director is the unpaid internship system, which is relatively unique among the other creative fields, but obviously not at all unique in today's economy more generally. In the interest of time, the following quote has been slightly condensed. The specter haunting the world of theater directing is the phenomenon of unpaid work. The entire subject is shrouded in a mist of taboo. The youth avoid the topic out of fear and shame, while those in positions of influence feign an attitude of befuddlement about the whole state of affairs. We systematically fail to acknowledge that the pedigreed path of internships, assistantships, and residencies is often restricted to those who, for whatever reasons, can afford to go months at a time without earning a New York City living wage. Young directors looking to build their professional chops, make industry connections, and perhaps one day apply to a prestigious MFA program are encouraged to assist established directors for little or no compensation. The resultant career model is a kind of apprenticeship system. A young director lucky enough to locate a master willing to take her on finds herself working for insufficient stipends, $200 a week, a Metro card, on the kind of production she could only dream of, but with no mode of transitioning into the role for which she is meant to be preparing herself. Entering into such a relationship with the director, let alone sustaining one over the years required to build up the resume, is simply not an option for most people. Many capable assistant directors retire early for this very reason, and countless more choose not to enter the field to begin with, perceiving it as a playground for the privileged. Finally, when asked what broader socioeconomic dynamics we can attribute the situation to, our informant has the following to say. I will leave a comprehensive social theory for you to expound. As with the art market, I think it has a lot to do with the growth of Broadway into a multi-billion-dollar industry sustained largely by tourism, as well as the rising costs of living and producing theater in New York. The proliferation of the unpaid internship is a feature of many sectors today, not only the arts. Culturally speaking, I would say that in contrast to the state-funded theaters of Europe, the American theater has always been about entertainment more than instruction, a public product rather than a public service. As such, it is subject to and inseparable from the market forces around it. Finally, to bring this all back to a field that I know something more about, which is not fine art printmaking, but contemporary art in a more general sense, I want to share with you an anecdote of something that happened to me in art school about a year ago. And what happened was I was taking this seminar. I forgot what it was called. It was something like career advice for artists. And the teacher started the class off by saying to everyone, I want you to take out a piece of paper and I want you to write down your career goals as you envision them for yourself. And I was kind of sitting there and I thought to myself, I know where this is going. She's going to use this as an opportunity to disabuse us of our illusions about our own career expectations. So I'm going to get ahead of the game here and I'm just going to put something very modest. I don't want to be a superstar. I don't want to be world famous. I just want to support myself with my art. That's all. And of course, what happened was that everyone else in the class had had the same thought, and everyone practically had said, I want to support myself with my art. I want to support myself with my art. And she collects all these pieces of paper and she reads them out loud and she says, so what you have to understand is that the chance that you are going to be able to support yourself with your art is practically nil. And for the rest of the seminar, it was this depressing series of statistics about how many artists, big-name artists that we've all heard of, support themselves by teaching or with day jobs of another description, or they happen to own property or whatever else it is, and just how few artists are able to actually support themselves with their art. And the weird thing is, and maybe this is not so weird given all that we've discussed already, by the time you get to that level where you are supporting yourself with your work as a visual artist, more likely than not, you're not just supporting yourself, you're already a superstar. There's no in between. There's the Jeff Koonses of the world, and there's everybody else who has to, make a living swiping floors or whatever it is, flipping burgers. As if that's realistic. And just as with all the other subfields we've talked about, there's, of course, a number of factors at work here. There's the disappearance of government funding for the arts. There's the rise of the mega galleries like Gagosian and David Sverner, which have managed to corner the market almost entirely by themselves. There's the rise of the MFA program, which is an extremely expensive investment that many artists are simply not able to afford. There's the general rise in the cost of living, healthcare, education, all across the country and in every field. And there's the rise of the art fair, which is, great for collectors, but really bad for artists and smaller galleries, because the barriers to entry to showing your work at an art fair are whatever the art fairs want to charge for a booth, which is exorbitantly high and unsustainably high for most galleries that would like to participate and most artists that would like to participate. So for all those reasons, being a middle-class artist is practically unsustainable today, if it ever was, but more so today than ever before. So even as there are more potential art buyers in the world today than ever before, and more money at the top of the market to buy that art with than ever before, the number of practical artists being sustained by the art market has dwindled to a few Jeff Koontzes and a Hilary Hahn. So to sum up here, it's not enough to simply blame the problems of contemporary artists on the population explosion over the last 50 to 100 years. While it's true that more people on the planet means that there are more people trying to be artists, it's also true, theoretically it should be true, that more people on the planet should mean more of a market for art, more of a market for music, more of a market for writing, etc. But, of course, that's not what's happening, and that's the problem. All of that expanded potential demand is being met by an ever-decreasing number of suppliers. Theoretically, then, the solution to this problem should be to harness the larger population that we have on the planet now to create a broader, more middle-class public for the arts. And next episode, I want to talk a little bit about how these systemic macrodynamics impact the microdynamics of interrelationships between artists and the people surrounding them. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.